Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to the Long COVID podcast. I'm delighted to welcome back Jenny Adams. Now, Jenny was on the podcast quite recently sharing her recovery story. So I highly recommend you go back and listen to that because it's really interesting. But today we're going to talk a bit more about this topic of perfectionism that comes up a lot with a lot of people in this kind of chronic illness world, and also kind of its integration with I don't know if that's even the right word, of kind of ADHD, and the sort of the busy brain, and how that with perfectionism can often be a little bit like a bit of a powder keg, I think. So in true perfectionism form, we are doing this unedited. So the challenge is laid down. Welcome back, Jenny. It's so nice to see you.
Thanks for having me back. Yeah, and let's give this a shot and see if we can nip our perfectionist tendencies in the bud and just get it done. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Exactly. I think I definitely felt last time when we put it out unedited, there were so many times where I nearly went back and I was like, oh, I'll just go look at that bit. I'll just. And like, I was like, no, no, no. It felt very liberating to do it, although it was very terrifying. So before we dive into this, would you just say a few words about yourself and what you do, and people who want to know more can go back and listen to the other episode?
Yeah, sure. And just on what you said, I think with perfectionism, I'm going to start already. It's so interesting that we're often the ones that are like nitpicking at things and no one else cares. It's us that are going, oh yeah, but what if they heard that little cough? What if? Like no one cares. Just get it out there. So yeah, anyway. So I'm Jenny Adams. I have recovered from ME, CFS, which I feel personally I had from ADHD burnout. I've still not got a diagnosis for ADHD. My assessment is next week. Yay, after a long list of waiting. So I got very, very ill in my probably my teens and my 20s, got glandular fever. I've got a history of trauma, unfortunately. And I think it was just that allostatic load of too much on my nervous system, having really crap boundaries, all this stuff that just impacted into burnout. And I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And it made me very, very sick. So I ended up using a wheelchair or a mobility scooter for a lot of my 20s. I have now fully recovered. I was off traveling in Spain last week. I'm off to America in a couple of months. So I'm off doing things, living my best life. Just been out walking this morning. So yeah, I'm living, which is amazing. And I also support people that are in a similar position to where I was, working with people with chronic illnesses, and more working with people who've got ADHD and ADHD burnout, because I've realized through my clients coming to me, I'd say probably 80% of them are women with undiagnosed ADHD. And all this, the masking and the shame and the trauma and the stuff that comes with ADHD often results in physical symptoms. So yeah, I help people that want to get away from those symptoms and get their lives back and not be so held back.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And I mean, it's interesting for me because there's an awful lot of people that I've noticed with long COVID, with ME/CFS, that have had or who have recovered from these, who have had kind of subsequent ADHD diagnoses. I don't have an ADHD diagnosis, but the more I learn about it, the more I think my brain certainly tends in that direction. Whether I have it or not, I don't know, and it's not relevant to me. But just understanding that my brain, you know, has some of those tendencies, I find is very useful. But before we dive into this, what is ADHD and how might someone recognize some of those traits in themselves?
So ADHD stands for attention deficit hyperactive disorder. You can also get ADD, which is attention deficit disorder, which I think the ADD type is more common in women, which is the inattentive type. The hyperactive is more seen in men and boys. I'm pretty sure I've got the hyperactive type because I can't sit still. But some of the traits that come with ADHD, a lot of people will have, but it's to what extreme? So things like being forgetful, having executive functioning issues. So what that means is our prefrontal cortex, the front of our brain, things like planning, time organization, emotional regulation, things like that we often struggle with. One of the classic things that most ADHDers will say is having like a gazillion thoughts and having all these ideas, and we're often very multi-passionate. We will often have lots of different hobbies. We'll be the people that can like bake and sew and knit and detail cars and like all the random things. These are just some of my hobbies that I've gone through, and they've gone to a hobby graveyard. But also there's the stuff that comes with it, like RSD, which is rejection sensitive dysphoria. I think that's what the D stands for, which is being very sensitive to emotion and feeling like we're being rejected. So, like for me, for example, I think I might have PMDD. I don't know what that stands for. Basically, like extreme PMS. The week before my period, at least, which is where I am right now, I just feel awful. I feel like everyone hates me. What's the point in doing anything? Like all these thoughts come into my head that and I've done a lot of work on myself. And I now have to say, my thoughts are not real. These are just hormones doing things and messing with my head. So there's more, often ADHDers are highly sensitive people as well. So we might have been the kids that, don't like loud noises, and we get very overwhelmed by sensory stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of nuances, and I've not covered all of the things, but yeah, there's a broad spectrum, and I think it's great more and more is being spoken about ADHD now. It is also on a spectrum, so most people can probably relate to some of those things, but it's to what extent does it disrupt and interrupt your life, I guess. So yeah, so for me, I do find some of these symptoms quite difficult to manage, but having dysregulated ADHD is like a million times worse. If you don't know that you have it and you don't have the tools in place to regulate your nervous system and it's already dysregulated, it can be a bit of a recipe for disaster. So often coming into that regulated nervous system, and this is sort of the work that I do, can be a huge help, because finding that kind of safety within ourselves means we're not having to fiddle with stuff. We're not having to, jump between stuff all the time. We can just be in ourselves and be okay, which can be really, really scary for a lot of us ADHDers. So yeah, hopefully that explains a little bit about what it is. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think what you said was so useful in that it's a spectrum.
Mhm.
And I think that's what's going to make this conversation relevant probably to everybody. Because even people who have some of these symptoms, maybe on quite a minor level, it's still useful to know how to manage them, to have tools in place for maybe when that particular thing rears itself up a little bit more. And of course, the regulating of the nervous system is so key for everybody. So yeah, that's really useful. Now, perfectionism. Is this something that is particularly common in ADHDers? Is it just common across the board? What do you see there in your sort of in your work, I suppose, and in yourself?
So I would say not everyone with ADHD is necessarily, a perfectionist, and not everyone with a chronic illness is necessarily a perfectionist either. But if you look at the general population, and this is just my observations, I've not looked at any clinical studies into this, but from what I see, generally, people who've got ME/CFS, long COVID, fibromyalgia, ADHD, there's often an element of trauma involved in their illness. And from that trauma often comes perfectionism. So I've trained with Gabor Maté, and obviously a massive fan of his. And one of the things that he would say is that perfectionism is a trauma response. And the more I look into it and understand what's driving it, the more I can see what he's talking about and where that comes from. And I definitely have some perfectionism tendencies, but I think I've become more relaxed. I have the motto now, done is better than perfect. So when my partner's moaning at me that I've not folded the washing as it comes out the tumble dryer, I'm like, it's going to stay in the tumble dryer for a week, or it's going to get taken out in one lump, and then it's going to get folded another day. So done is better than perfect. And I think that is another thing with ADHDs in particular, is that all or nothing thinking. So it either gets left in the tumble dryer, or it gets all gets done perfectly. There is no in between. And those are both kind of either end of a spectrum of a dysregulated nervous system. Like, where is the safety in the middle of, I can do this, the task gets done, and it's okay.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. Yeah, and I think, I mean, this is so interesting. I mean, I see some of these traits in myself, some worse than others. And, I guess coming back to the regulation thing, when you're busy getting really, really, really stressed about something else, that's when I start to notice some of these tendencies come out more. So, the washing, for example, I have a massive pile of washing that my partner has very carefully folded and piled up on the counter for me to put away. And it's been there for about 3 weeks and it's getting higher. Every week, a new layer gets put on. And it's almost like the more washing that I get put on there, the bigger task it becomes. And rather than just putting a few t-shirts away when I have a moment before I go to bed or when I get up, it's like, oh, that's a big task. Oh, no, we'll leave that. We'll wait for layer 4.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm being silly, it's a silly example, but it's these sort of things where you start to notice them as you get a bit more awareness. You're like, oh, okay, that's very interesting, isn't it?
And
Um,
you say that's silly, but I would challenge that, because these are the
okay.
real life issues that they can be really fucking hard to deal with. Because, like, for example, I got back from Spain on Saturday night. I'd gone into anaphylactic shock the weekend before. I then got put on steroids for a week, which is, steroids are just stress hormones. So I wasn't sleeping for a week. I've come home. We're on a late night flight, and then I've got a cold as well at the moment. So obviously my body's been through a lot in the last week or so, and I'm unpacking my suitcase, and we're at well, it's the beginning of October right now. So summer wardrobe's going away, it's getting colder, and I'm sitting on the floor with my winter jumpers out, my summer clothes, my suitcase, and I'm just sat there crying because I'm like, there's just too much stuff and I don't know where to start. And that is one of those real moments of dysregulation of it might seem silly, but it's that extra layer on your pile of washing that it just breaks you sometimes. And when we get stuck in that all or nothing thinking, we don't see that there's another possibility that we could maybe break this down into smaller tasks. We could take half of it, we could do a quarter of it. So I had my meltdown. I went and looked after myself because I realized, okay, I'm dysregulated right now. Cleaning up, putting my washing away is not going to make me feel any different because often that's behind the perfectionism is if I do X, Y, and Z, therefore I will feel. And we get stuck in that mindset and we think, well, once I've done that, I'll feel like this. Once I've done that, I'll feel like this. Well, actually, we don't always feel like that once we've done the thing. And often we can find that same feeling without doing the thing. So I might say, okay, well, I'll feel relaxed once I've sorted out my summer and winter wardrobes. Well, actually, maybe if I put that away, well, literally close the door and walk away from it, and just go and ask my partner to give me a hug, I will feel relaxed. So that same feeling that we're chasing isn't always going to be given to us by doing the thing. And we can get tricked into this and we can run. I call it like the I'll be happy when syndrome, that we get stuck. Or once I've done this, I'll be happy. Or once I earn this amount, I'll be happy. Or once I've achieved this, once I've done that, I'll be happy. But what happens when we do that? We end up chasing the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And then we're just constantly running towards stuff. And we're not actually taking a moment now to either regulate ourselves and give us that feeling that we need, or to, yeah, just to look after ourselves and be in the present moment and be like, does my washing need to be put away that badly right now? Or do I need to look after myself?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And this, perfectionism is something that I'm working on. It was something that I mean, if you'd have asked me, say, like 5 years ago, are you a perfectionist? I would have probably said maybe a little bit, but I would have seen it as a good thing. It was what made me a good musician. It was what made me a conscientious um, member of staff. It was what made me, I would have seen it as a good quality. And I think I'm now starting to come around to this understanding that actually it's not, and that there's this concept of good enough. And I don't know where that is because I've never found it in my life before. So I'm hunting for where good enough is. But it's realizing, I think, kind of like you just said, that if we're always striving to be perfect, we are never going to be perfect because we are never going to be happy with something because we'll always find something else that we could have done. Maybe, you're doing a painting and you're like, oh, I'll do a bit more, I'll do a bit more, oh, maybe I could do a bit more. There's always going to be something. And then you get to the point where you've done too much and it's like, oh, it's not perfect. I need to take some away. And, in the context of painting, you can't do that. So it's this, yeah, you're never going to be happy if you're always striving for that perfection. So how can I find a way to be okay with that, I suppose? And that's kind of where I'm at the moment. I'm kind of struggling with this. I want to be free of it, but I'm not quite there. So I suppose, and in the context of recovery, you said that thing about all or nothing. Recovery is about those little steps, isn't it? It's not, I found the one thing, everything's going to be perfect. Like I've not met anyone who that was true for. So, this is where I guess it can be really unhealthy, I suppose, in that sort of context. But I don't think it's ever a good thing, actually. I think that's what I'm kind of coming to realize. I don't think there's really any situation where perfectionism is a good thing. And I'm not going to edit that out. That's staying in.
Love it. Yeah, it's so interesting because I have definitely I've said it in interviews, I put it on my CV in the past. Oh, I can be a bit of a perfectionist, as if it's a good thing. Because, and again, if we get praised for this, I might have been hired because of that in a previous job. So it makes perfect sense why we would stick to perfectionism traits. And I think they stem from a belief of not being either worthy or good enough or feeling unsafe and needing to control things. That if I have done things perfectly, nothing can go wrong. And it's really interesting that you mentioned that in regards to recovery, because recovery is not perfect. It's messy. And I don't know anyone that's recovered who hasn't had bumps in the road and days where they're like, oh my God, have I just reversed everything? I've been doing so well. Oh my God, what have I done? Going through all of that, all of those thoughts. And I'm going to cough just a sec. Okay, I'm back. I've got a bit of a cold for anyone listening. Um, yeah, we're going to have those bumps in the road, and it's okay. It's okay to have them. And it can be interesting to ask yourself, and maybe we could try this with an example with you if you want, is
Mhm.
going into, you know, how would you feel if things were done a certain way or not a certain way. So yeah, if you want to have a little dive into some compassionate inquiry and belief excavation, do you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, I'm all for being a guinea pig. It's that vulnerability, isn't it, that I think is important. And maybe this comes with the perfectionism thing, that not wanting to be vulnerable because you're leaving yourself open to being imperfect, I suppose, isn't it?
Mhm.
So yeah, let's do it.
Okay, okay. So can you think of an example in recently that has been triggering to your perfectionism?
We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
Mm, yes. I mean, the obvious example would be the episode that we did recently,
Okay, okay.
I suppose. So we
So,
did it unedited. It was largely pretty good, but it was a little untidy in places.
okay. And what kind of feelings or thoughts were coming up around leaving it unedited?
So I think it was partly that, well, I could do better, so I should do better. This idea of what better actually is, this the sort of perfect, um, like you were saying earlier, with, if there's a little scuff in some audio somewhere, unless it's really, unless it's someone coughing really loudly for a long time, which could be triggering, it's probably not a problem. And I can logically tell myself all of these things, that it was a good interview, that, it was fine, it flowed nicely. There was nothing that really needed to be edited, but it was that not knowing. It was that I didn't spend 2 hours going through it, listening to it, fixing every tiny little thing that didn't matter, but I would have fixed it anyway,
Okay.
and letting it go.
Okay. So I'm hearing there's two things in here. There's a belief I could do better, so I should do better, and potentially some fear around the unknown of
Mm.
leaving it out there naked, unedited, and not knowing if there's something wrong with it.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay.
Um,
Which one of those feels most prevalent?
hmm, Probably they're both quite prevalent actually. Um, Probably the I could do better, therefore I should. If there are hours in the day, then I should use them to better myself or my whatever it is I'm doing, I suppose.
Okay. Okay. So how far back does this go?
Oh, a very long way.
Okay. Can you remember?
Definitely, definitely back to sort of when I was a teenager, when I was at school, maybe beyond that. Um, but certainly, yeah, certainly kind of young teenager, I think.
Okay. And did anything happen around that sort of time?
Um, I mean, nothing particularly abnormal beyond being at school, being a teenager. I was a geek. I wasn't cool. I played the cello and I listened to classical music, so there were people at school that didn't like me. Um, I mean, that might have been when I last didn't worry about what people thought about me. I was quite happy to be uncool. I mean, it's not like I really care about being cool, but that kind of like worrying about what other people think. I feel like maybe at that point I didn't so much. Whereas
Okay.
now I don't want to, but I do, I think,
Okay.
maybe.
And that idea of I could do better, so I I should. I should do better.
Mm.
Did you feel that when you were a teenager?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I definitely remember it being a sort of a thing with schoolwork. Certainly my parents, always wanting me to do my best, and sort of pushing me to do better, to try harder. Probably with good intentions.
Okay. So if your parents were pushing you then to do your best, as parents do, and this is we're not pointing the finger at anybody here,
Mm.
but this can be interesting where some of these beliefs come from. What did you make it mean if you were doing things perfectly?
I mean, was I ever doing things perfectly? Um, I think that was maybe the problem. I was always pushing myself to do things perfectly, but I never was.
Okay. And
So I needed to keep doing them more in order to be perfect, but that never happened. So the cycle.
okay. And how do you think your parents would have reacted if you had done things perfectly?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose I wanted them to be proud of me, to, you know, respect and love me, like you want from parents, I suppose. And I suppose I thought that if I was perfect, then they would.
Okay. And just want to check in, is this okay to keep looking into this? Because I know this can
Yeah,
be
this is interesting.
okay. Okay. So your parents would be proud of you if you were doing things well, if you were doing things perfectly. And what does that mean from your parents that they'd be proud of you?
That's interesting. Um, I mean, and maybe it's that search for affection, um, that I thought if they were proud of me, and maybe it's not just my parents, maybe it was other people around me, but I thought yeah, if they were proud of me, then I would get something in return, I suppose. I'm not sure what that something is.
Okay. You've just said
Uh,
affection, which can be obviously tied into love there.
hmm,
And this is why we're poking at this a little, because what I'm hearing is there can be a belief with perfectionism. If I do things perfectly, therefore I will be loved and I'll be accepted.
yeah. So maybe it's that acceptance, maybe affection and love as well, but maybe acceptance is more. Um, although the irony being actually acceptance for being imperfect would would maybe be more accepting. Um, uh, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Mhm. And
So it's that search for acceptance, for affection, for, yeah, all of that sort of stuff.
Mm. And if there's also the counter belief then that if you aren't worthy of love, if you don't do things right, if you don't do things perfectly, you said you were probably an early teenager, but if that goes back any further, even if you were an early teenager, how do you think they would feel? A youngish teenager feeling that they're not worthy of love and affection from their parents.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, being a teenager is difficult enough anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's really I feel for kids now. Like I think it's possibly more difficult now than it was when I was a kid with the whole social media thing. Um, it's difficult. There's an awful lot going on as a teenager, isn't there? Or as a kid in general.
Would it be okay to check in with your body here?
Hmm.
Because notice I asked, how would you think it would feel? And you told me a story. So how do you think it would feel to be a teenager that feels unworthy?
Yeah, difficult, uncomfortable, looking for ways to either feel worthy or to, I suppose, distract yourself from that.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think it would feel? What are you noticing that's going on now?
Yeah, I'm definitely feeling kind of squirmy in my stomach.
Mm-hmm.
I can feel myself. I mean, I guess I feel that I'm gently rocking myself.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I think I do when I feel on edge or, like I need to regulate myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I can feel myself doing that more than I was when we started speaking.
Okay. Okay. So there's a want to soothe the discomfort here.
Yeah.
Would it feel okay to maybe welcome in this squirmy feeling in your stomach? And rather than needing to change it, just let it be there and get
Mm.
curious. Like, how big
Yeah.
is it?
Um, it's definitely there. It's not overpowering.
Mm-hmm. Is it moving?
It feels a bit more static
Okay.
for now.
Okay. And if this sensation could speak, what would it want to say?
It feels very stuck. It feels like it would like to, maybe would like to move forward, would like, yeah, to become unstuck.
Okay. So it would like to be moved, changed, unstuck.
Mm.
Okay. And can you give it the opportunity to do that?
Yeah, so how do I do that?
So tune in and really ask what it wants. Does it want you to stretch? Does it want you to pay attention? What does it want? With compassion from you.
I feel like just giving it a bit of space there, it has slightly moved.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely still there, but it's less static,
Okay.
less stuck. Yeah, I can feel that I've hunched over as well.
Okay.
So people listening will obviously not be able to see this, but yeah, I've kind of hunched over in my body while we've been talking, I think.
Mm-hmm. And
Um,
those listening might be able to hear the slight change in your voice as well.
Possibly, yeah.
So is there a
Yeah.
protective element here that's brought you in on yourself that it doesn't want to? Because often if we're feeling we're shrinking, if we're in that dorsal polyvagal state, doing the opposite is often too much for our nervous system.
Mm.
So as you're doing, just allowing it space Would it feel okay to just check in now and see how it is?
Yeah, it feels much less. So I feel like I haven't like stretched my arms out or anything, but I've definitely slightly uncurled myself a little bit.
Hmm.
And I'm still doing the gentle rocking,
Hmm.
but I feel like I've done a bit less of that now.
Hmm.
It's a little bit less movement there, but I feel a bit more comfortable sitting up. In fact, I just felt my shoulders move back.
Hmm. I just saw an openness in your face then, and you're looking
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I just felt that. That was quite intense
up.
actually. Um, yeah.
How you doing now?
Yeah, I feel much more like that ball of whatever it was. It's a lot smaller.
Okay.
I think it's maybe a baked bean rather than a melon now. Um,
Love that.
um, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how just kind of sitting with that, it moves around, changes, goes through this kind of like transformation almost.
Hmm. And
And
if that sort of knot, that squirmy feeling in your stomach,
mm,
how you felt maybe when you were a teenager and you were starting to make these beliefs that if I do X, Y, and Z perfectly, therefore I will get proud parents, acceptance, love. That has a physical feeling in
mm,
us, and we'll hold on to that. And this is often where the long COVID and the ME and the fibromyalgia and all of these things come into place because we're still holding on to that. The fact that you quite quickly identified something in your body as telling you something when we looked at a belief means there's still some stuff here. And
yeah.
it's a bit like an onion. We can kind of peel back these layers. Um, but the only way out really is through is feeling this stuff. And it doesn't mean you have to just sit with all of your discomfort forever, but not fighting it so much and just giving it a little bit of space to be felt. Because what would you have done normally with this sort of sensation?
I would either have ignored it and pushed on through, or I would have told myself to stop being ridiculous, or yeah, shut
Okay.
it down, steamroll it over it.
Okay. And does that work?
No, not at all.
So what did you just learn from that process of actually letting it be here?
That it moves through if you give it the space to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously we're recording this, so you could potentially go back and look at how long that took.
Mm.
But generally the wave of an emotion takes about 90 seconds to move through. And I think I've had some clients who've said they've had a really tough emotion. They've literally just counted for 90 seconds and said, I can get through 90 seconds of discomfort. And it will come up and it drops down again and it leaves generally. So yeah, how many of us can actually say, okay, I can deal with 90 seconds of discomfort? It's the reason I have a cold shower every day for 30 seconds because I stand there and I'm like, I don't want to do this. I can do hard things.
Yeah. And I think part of the sort of discomfort, if you know that you've got a time limit on it, then that makes it a lot easier, doesn't it? If I think, gosh, I've got to sit here and I don't know how long it's going to take, if I'm going to, like, maybe it's coming back to that all or nothing thing that we were talking about a moment ago, actually. It's like, well, if I'm going to do it, I've got to do it right. So I've got to allow myself like half a day because I don't know how long it's going to take. And who can find half a day? Whereas if you know, okay, this could take maybe 90 seconds, it might be a little longer, but this whole process could take like 5, 10 minutes. That's that's a bit more manageable. Um,
Yeah. And if we push it away, it gets bigger. and it takes longer to deal with. Like I was always that person. I've always been quite an emotional, sensitive person. I would swallow down the tears, I'd keep them in, and I would try so bloody hard to keep all of this in. And then something tiny would happen and it was an explosion. And I'd be in a meeting in work, or it was a really inappropriate time and I would just be sobbing, I couldn't breathe, and people around me are like, oh my God, like what's wrong with her? But it's because I'd kept it in, I kept it in, I kept it in, and it's like one tiny thing, just bang, too much. Whereas now, if I feel a little bit of something, I'm like, just cry. Like I was crying yesterday. I think I cried about 4 times yesterday. I went to see my mum, and yeah, she was just like, what's wrong? What's happened? What's triggered you? And I'm like, nothing. I just feel sad. I just need to cry, and I just need to be comforted. And she is starting to understand more now that like there's a feeling sometimes, and there doesn't necessarily always need to be a reason. And especially when we've had trauma, once we kind of allow those floodgates to open and say, I'm okay with being in this discomfort, you don't always know why. Sometimes you're just going to feel sad. Sometimes you're going to feel angry. And it's following your body a little bit like you did, just going in and asking, well, what does this need? And often it wants to be heard or it wants space to be felt. It just wants some kind of acknowledgement. Sometimes it will be a bubbling up of a reaction of, I wish I could say this from that time, unspoken words, that sort of thing. But your body is smarter than our heads. So, it's allowing yourself to really drop in and just ask your body, ask that sensation, what do you need? It doesn't need to make any sense, but if it tells you something, it will 99.9% of the time be the right thing.
Mm. Yeah. So if we find ourselves doing this kind of, the perfectionism spiral, where, oh, I've got 20 million things on my to-do list. I don't know where to start. So again, the all or nothing. And we feel it in our bodies if we listen to our bodies. We feel like the head, we get that overwhelm. Sometimes, certainly I do when I'm thinking, I don't know where to start. This is such a big task. It's got to be done perfectly. And actually, what you said a moment ago about the all or nothing thing, I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, this is absolutely me. This is why I can never get started on my to-do list, and I'll sit there on Facebook for 2 hours instead of starting, because instead of doing one thing, then it's like everything's got to get done. So when we find ourselves in this kind of position, and it's going to look different to different people, but that kind of perfectionisming, what's the best thing to do? Is it to sit back and say, where do I feel this? Give myself a bit of space. What's my body telling me? Or are there other strategies that can also be useful?
So I would say the first thing is to check in with your body and notice, are you dysregulated? Because exactly what you just said, oh my God, I don't know where to start. I've got a million things on my to-do list. That overwhelm is most of the time a dysregulation. And then we get stuck in a freeze response and you go, I'll just procrastinate and go on Facebook for 2 hours because we don't have the motivation to get up and do anything. So when we are overwhelmed, regulate. So that can literally be if you are sat on your computer on Facebook, noticing I'm sitting on Facebook, I've been here for half an hour, I don't want to move, I need to pee, but I don't want to move. Okay, take your eyes off the screen, start to look around your room, start to just take some gentle movements. You're orienting yourself to there not being a threat. And if you're in a freeze response, that's a very, very old part of our nervous system. That is the only thing we can do when we're about to get killed, basically. And our body is telling us that, which is why we're sat on Facebook for 2 hours. If you start to look around and go, okay, there's no threats here, start to gently move your body, unfreezing yourself, stretching, even just taking some deeper breaths, maybe laughing out loud, anything that would say to your body, there is not a threat here right now. And then once you're in that, if you're in that dorsal state, we kind of need to move into that sympathetic. And that's when we're like the doing mode. That's when you can start to go, right, okay, I've unfrozen. Let's get some shit done. And that would be a really good time to then look at your to-do list when you're feeling a little bit more regulated and say, okay, what's the priority? How can I make this smaller? Where do I start? And if your mind is just going, oh my God, I don't know, I can't, go back to regulating. And there's loads of tools, grounding, orienting, titration, resourcing, all sorts of somatic nervous system regulation tools. They're going to be different for everyone. Some people like certain things. So find what works for you, unfreeze yourself, regulate first, and then look at your to-do list and start to ask, yeah, how do I make this smaller? Does this need to be done today? Does this need to be done by me? What's the priority? What's urgent? And there are lots of practical tips like, writing lists and reminders and all of that sort of stuff. But I honestly, hand on heart, believe you need to start with the regulation first, because you're just going to be going into a task dysregulated and it won't work. And then you'll be like, well, I've tried all the things. It's not the things, it's the nervous system.
Yeah,
And finding
that's so
compassion.
interesting.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Compassion, I think, is so important. Yeah, it's so interesting what you were just saying, because there are some times where I'll sit down and I'll be like, right, what are we starting with? Okay. And I'll just work myself through my to-do list. Boom, productivity unlocked. And then there are some days where I just, as I described a moment ago, I just sit there and I'm like, I don't know where to start. Okay, I'll procrastinate. I'll do it in a minute. Oh, I'll do this. I'll do that, and I just can't seem to get myself started. So that's actually because I'm unregulated, dysregulated in those situations.
Mhm.
What I found quite useful for me is understanding, are there different things I can do in order to set myself up for a day where I'm a bit more regulated. So I know that if I get outside, and you can't do this every day necessarily, but if I get up early, I get my arse out of bed and I get down and have a swim first thing, especially if the sun is shining. But even if it's not, then I'm killing it for the rest of the day. I'm amazing. I'm on
Mhm.
fire. I am, yeah, productivity, kind of king. Whereas if I have one of those days where maybe I haven't slept very well, I wake up, I scroll on my phone for a bit. I, have my breakfast at the wrong time, or I, have hot chocolate for breakfast or whatever. It's like I'm setting myself up already for this kind of like, day where it's just not going to happen.
Mhm.
So certainly for me, certainly setting up my day in the right way, can be really helpful.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to say that, well, two things. One, that we are cyclical beings. So,
Mm.
especially women who are still menstruating, and men can follow the moon cycle, or anyone who's not menstruating. So we are going to go through different phases. So when we're in like our ovulation phase, for example, that's our full moon. That's when we're out there. We want to talk to people. We're very social. We've got high estrogen levels. Like we can do anything. That's not going to be when you're going to go through your to-do list necessarily. That's when you're going to be recording podcasts and, networking and socializing. At the opposite end of that, when you're having your bleed, that is when you might get some of those last little niggly tasks done, but you're also not going to want to talk to anybody. And you're going to be quite introverted and want to hibernate. And it, being able to track your cycles and look at where you feel better in your cycle. When is the time to organize your diary? When is the time to socialize? When is the time to go through your emails and sort them out? Rather than trying to do things that aren't going to be helping ourselves, we're forcing ourselves to be social when we want to be at home hibernating. It just doesn't work. So, really leaning into when you function best, doing what in your cycle can be really, really helpful. And secondly, this whole idea of how productive we are, like we're not robots, we're not machines. So, yes, we have to get stuff done, but like our value, our worthiness, how loved we are, is nothing to do with how productive we are. And I think in this, I don't know, Western modern society, whatever you want to say, we are so conditioned to equal, well, the more I do, the better I am. The better I am as a human, the more loved I am, whatever bullshit we put on it. And like, let's unpick that and realize we are human beings first. And then the stuff comes secondary. So look after the body first, because most of the stuff we do, for most of us, it's not life or death. If we can't do a thing, no one's gonna die, generally, unless you're a doctor or something. But yeah, so look after ourselves first. And also knowing that rest is productive. So if we're going, and we keep pushing, our work quality gets worse and worse the longer we work. So it is really helpful to stop and have breaks and not feel guilty for it, because we actually get more done. So I've got a a mantra on my Remarkable here. Well, it says that the less I do, the more I make. And I'm really a fan of that. We don't have to work like 30 hours a day in order to be good business people, be good humans. The less we do often, the more productive we can be, because we're focusing on what actually we're good at.
Yeah, and this was something that I really struggled with when I wasn't well, because I couldn't do stuff. So I felt unworthy. And it's coming back to this, your most important thing is that you are human, you are you, and everything else, as you say, is secondary. And, this ties in really nicely with the perfectionism thing, doesn't it? Because, what even is that? You're perfect as you are. And that that productivity, the things that you want to do in your life, that they're important to you, but the healthier you are, the more regulated you are, the better you're going to do them anyway.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And often that perfectionism is just like having that compassion for ourselves and just asking, is this coming from me not feeling safe? Do I want to control something? Am I dysregulated? Do I feel not enough here? And just, hand on heart, just giving yourself an internal hug and saying to yourself, however you want to talk to yourself in a kind way, to just say, it's okay. I know you're trying to do this to feel safe, or whatever the thing is, it will be okay. Let's look after this body first, and then we'll attempt the thing. So really just finding that compassion, because I know it can be really hard when you're unwell and you aren't able to be productive. And if you don't have that belief that your worthiness is tied into how productive you are, you're going to feel pretty shit. You are still a very valid, lovable human, even if you can't do things. And maybe looking at all the things, all the ways that you bring joy to your family, to your life, to people around you. And yeah, just finding that compassion for yourself, because you're not a machine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a beautiful place to leave it. Jenny, thank you so much. This has been really useful for me, although it was definitely quite scary putting myself out there. So thank you. And yeah, thank you for all your advice and for taking the time to speak to me again.
Well done for being vulnerable. And thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Hopefully that's helped a few people that are listening.
Thank you so much to all of my guests, and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch